Hello and welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, a discussion series in the intersect of philosophy of science and theology. In this series we'll be focusing on topics on time and memory. My name is Buki Fatona. I'm a researcher here at the University of Oxford in philosophy of science and religion. Some of our interviewees will also be from the University of Oxford, whilst others will be from further afield. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this episode of Phil-Sci-Theo. With me today is Dr Tim Middleton, Tutorial Fellow in Theology and Director of the Centre for Baptist Studies at Regent's Park College here at the University of Oxford. Dr Middleton's research focuses on the intersections of theology and religion with science, nature and the environment. Specifically, he is interested in religious approaches to the contemporary ecological crisis, and much of his work is in the field of Christian eco-theology. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today, Dr Middleton.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. The first question is this. You have PhDs both in earth science and theology. How do you see the relationship between the fields of science on the one hand and religion?
I think it's a good question. I think it's also quite a complicated question. So the first thing I would say probably is that I don't think there is one single relationship. So I'm quite influenced by a book by Peter Harrison called Territories of Science and Religion. Peter Harrison's primarily a historian, and one of the things that I think he shows in that book really nicely is that the categories, science and religion, are slippery.
Yes.
They have changed historically. They're both comparatively young terms, only around for the last few hundred years.
Yes.
A lot of what we sometimes talk about in science and religion is older than that, and therefore the terms science and religion don't even necessarily quite apply.
Yes.
And for all those reasons, I think it's quite hard to talk about a single relationship between science and religion. So I kind of tend to think of it as an umbrella for a range of different conversations.
Okay.
And one of the things I find myself saying sometimes, actually with students teaching as well, is even if you accept them as stable categories today, which I'm not 100% sure you can do, there are lots of different sciences and lots of different religions. And you could draw up a table, right, where you list world religions across one axis and sciences down the other. And that's the science and religion set of conversations.
Yes.
And if you look at which sort of grid, which squares of that grid are filled in, it's not very many of them, from what I can tell. There's a lot of literature, for example, on Christianity and certain aspects of biology, or Christianity and aspects of physics. So one of the things I'm interested in doing is seeing if we can fill in a few more squares in that grid, both by moving to religions beyond Christianity, which is not really my own area of expertise, but also by starting dialogues with other sciences. So my background being in earth sciences, there has been a little bit of interaction between the earth sciences and Christian theology, but not much. And so I think that's part of that conversation where there could be a little bit more to say, in fact. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, not one neat single relationship, because when you go into each of those grid squares, you'll get a mixture of different things. You'll get sometimes the appearance that science and religion are perhaps in conflict, sometimes them not really having anything to say to each other.
Yes.
And that's perhaps part of the reason why some of those grid squares are underdeveloped. Maybe people have just felt, well, actually there isn't really anything theological about this particular piece of work in earth sciences, for example. But also scope for interaction in a fruitful way and a fruitful dialogue. And it's those aspects of the conversation that I guess are particularly interesting to science and religion scholars. But yeah, does that make sense as
It does make sense.
Sort of approach? Yeah.
What occurred to me as you were talking is that part of maybe why sections of grids within that grid are absent is because it takes a lot of qualifications like yours to bridge the gaps, and you have to be qualified in two seemingly disparate fields to be able to maybe bring those subjects together in in a sophisticated way. Perhaps that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, as I was just saying, I don't feel remotely qualified to comment on non-Christian religions in relation to the sciences. And to be honest, I've ended up where I am slightly by accident. You know, I didn't set out at the beginning thinking, oh, I'm going to do earth sciences and then I'm going to do theology because I need to fill in this grid square.
Yes.
I guess it's almost a kind of lucky coincidence that I became interested in theology, and then when I moved into theology I had this background in earth sciences and realised that I could go back to it to try and do some work in this area. So it's almost by accident, but I think you're right. There's not necessarily many people who have the opportunity to study two seemingly very different things, and I don't know. I mean, you definitely need that sort of expertise sometimes. I don't think that means they're the only people who are allowed to talk about these things.
Yes, I agree with you. So the next question is this, and I as someone who works on philosophy of time in relation to memory, I once heard you mention the phrase deep time, and I didn't know what that was. I'm not sure I know what it is. So what is deep time?
Yeah, I feel a little bit nervous speaking to a philosopher about this because it isn't anything terribly complicated or terribly philosophical, really. The way I see the phrase being used and the way I interpret it is just to mean very long, i.e. geological lengths of time.
Yes.
So thousands of years, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, maybe even billions of years.
Yeah.
So at its root, it's just very long periods of time, and there's not necessarily any particular philosophy of time attached to that. I mean, that's potentially slightly debatable, but at least in the first instance, as an earth scientist would use it, they don't think they're invoking anything other than a very long time scale. Okay. Most of what's been written about deep time tends to refer to the geological past.
Yes.
So you look at different geological time periods when major events happened in Earth history, and you might say that they happened in deep time. And there's quite a lot of interesting work as well about the origins of humanity and where the kind of connection points are between human history and so-called deep history. That's the way a lot of the literature has used that phrase up till now. But I guess my interest is slightly different in as much as I've seen various people start using the phrase deep time to refer to the future, not just the past.
Yes.
And particularly, therefore, to refer to very long periods of time in the future. What's going to happen in the geological future, a million years from now on this planet, which is in some ways an almost impossible thing to talk about. But I think it's interesting, and one of the places that this phrase has cropped up is in environmental and ecological writing, particularly in the popular sphere of late. Yes. So people are worried about the sorts of damage that human beings are causing to life on this planet and the planet itself at the moment, and how long that will last into the future. So if, for example, you look at species diversity, for example, it's often said that we're currently causing the sixth great mass extinction event on Earth as a result of human activities. There's going to be a mass extinction equivalent to when the dinosaurs died out, for example. And we know from the speed at which biological evolution takes place that were we to kind of completely follow through and cause an extinction of that magnitude, it will take hundreds of thousands of years for the natural processes of evolution to recover the level of species of diversity we have today. Similarly, when we're pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it will take hundreds of thousands of years for that carbon dioxide to be removed from the atmosphere under natural processes.
Yes.
I mean, humans might devise ways to remove the CO2, but according to the purely kind of natural rhythms, these things are going to last for an incredibly long amount of time. And I think people are using these facts kind of rhetorically in environmental discussions at the moment, because when we realise just how long these things are going to last for, it's a bit of a shock to the system, right? We think twice maybe about some of our environmental attitudes and behaviours when we come to realise that what we do now, what we do in the next couple of decades, it's going to have reverberations for the planet that last millions of years.
Yes.
That's the shock tactic that I see people using when they invoke this phrase deep time. So yeah, as I say, I'm afraid it's nothing terribly clever philosophically speaking, but it's this geological definition that I'm interested in.
I think it's fascinating, especially connecting it to future time, because there is something, there's a disconnect between me and I guess most humans, and thinking about the future for millions of years' time and wondering how I could have an impact on that time scale, but then realizing that processes that occurred backwards in time have huge impacts on me being here. Then you suddenly realize that yes, my actions today could reverberate for that length of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's true for human action in general. I think there is also a question of scale, and that's one of the things that people say is somewhat different about the contemporary moment. So, sure, human actions reverberate for long periods of time. That's always been true. But the impact that humans collectively are having on planetary processes at the moment is at a scale that's never been seen before. And that's what's potentially kind of alarming or shocking about the current ecological crisis. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does make sense.
Yeah.
I know. I said it in highly individualistic terms, but I was trying to lay to its bare bones. But yes, collective human action, and on an unprecedented, detrimental scale to the planet, is what you're specifically referring to. So to reiterate a question from one of your articles, how might deep time feature in the science and religion debate?
Sure, yeah. I mean, one of the things I should maybe have said in relation to what deep time is the person who is normally credited as discovering deep time, who's the Scottish geologist James Hutton. And
what period of time was he around?
So late 18th century.
Okay.
So his famous book, it was actually delivered as a lecture initially, I think, Theory of the Earth. Okay. It was published 1788. Okay. And that's, so one of the things to say, he doesn't use the phrase deep time. He's credited as being the discoverer of deep time, but the actual language, actual phrase, is attributed to a 20th century writer and journalist, John McPhee. So it's only much later that we've got this specific terminology. But what Hutton was doing was looking at various geological formations, particularly in Scotland. So one of the famous examples of a field site he visited is a place called Sicker Point, which is on the Berwickshire coast, just east of Edinburgh. And this is the picture that you will often see kind of attached to some of these things. And it's a picture of some rocks by the sea. And what you see is a whole load of rocks stacked vertically like this, and on top a whole load of rocks horizontally. Okay. And what Hutton realised is that you need an incredibly long period of time for that to come about geologically. So if you lay down sediments at the bottom of the ocean horizontally, then you need some sort of tectonic event to tilt them up on end. Then they need to be eroded off to create a flat surface. Then they need to be put back under the ocean to have more sediments layered on top. That's a process that, at least when we look around and observe how quickly geology takes place today, assuming that geology in the past happens at the same rate that it does today, that's a process that takes millions of years. And that line between the vertical rocks and the horizontal rocks is called an unconformity. And so observation of unconformities is what leads to this discussion about deep time. You asked how this features in the science and religion dialogue. I guess the sort of initial thing is it expands our temporal horizons. So one of the things that the discovery of the kind of depth of geological time in the past allows, if you like, was it paved the way for Darwin's understanding of evolution. Because Darwin similarly needed very long amounts of time in order to understand the evolution of species. So it wasn't until geologists had posited such large timescales that Darwin could then say what he said. And both of those events, geologically and biologically, have repercussions in the science and religion world. So on the first hand, there's discussions about the age of the Earth, for example, and then the second, there's discussions about creation versus evolution. And both of those things depend on this discovery of the depth of time.
Yes.
And another person who I think is interesting for this conversation is Stephen Jay Gould,
Yes.
who is someone who crops up in the science and religion world, specifically for a theory he has about non-overlapping magisteria. So this idea that science and religion are these two totally separate magisteria or realms that deal with different things. They're totally independent. So science is the world of facts, religion is the world of values and purpose, and they shouldn't interact. So he's famous for that theory, but he also says some really interesting stuff about time.
Yeah.
So he has a book called Time's Arrow, Time's Cycle, and in the opening pages of that book, he talks about a few different scientific discoveries and the impact they've had on human beings and the human sense of our place in the world. And these are all, if you like, the hot topics for science and religion. So he talks about the Copernican revolution, the Darwinian revolution, and the Freudian revolution, which are often referred to as three narcissistic wounds, as in three ways in which humanity has discovered that it's not as important as it thought it was, and therefore in some sense wounded itself. So we're not at the centre of the solar system. The solar system is heliocentric rather than geocentric. We're also not as different as we like to think from the other species. We are a product of evolution. We're also not even as rational as we like to think in terms of what's going on in our own minds. So those are the first three revolutions. And what Gould says is the discovery of the depth of geological time is the fourth narcissistic wound. And in a sense, the one that we have grappled with least, certainly in the science and religion world. Quite a lot is written on, Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, but not much has been written about this depth of geological time. And it has a similar effect. It makes us feel similarly, potentially unimportant. We inhabit such a small slice of geological time. This is something that theologians need to wrestle with. Any theologian thinking about the place or purpose or role of human beings, constructing a theological anthropology, if you like, needs to think, I think, and Gould thinks about how little of geological time we have existed for.
Yeah. I mean, I think what is fascinating about time, deep time as the fourth narcissistic wound is that it cuts across the other wounds. So the Copernican revolution is physics, but it involves time, doesn't it?
Right, yeah.
And Darwinian one is evolutionary and involves time, and I would think of it as biology. And Freudian is psychology, but also involves time because we'll be looking at memory in a minute and future-directed thinking. So it cuts across and yet is the least explored. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about there not being so much conversation in that grid square that is earth sciences and theology, or at least the majority of what's gone on has been about the age of the earth, right? But I think there's more to it than that, and there's more to explore there. Yeah.
Thank you. In your work, do you use different models or a particular conception of memory? Would you like me to offer examples of models of memory? Or do you have ideas of some?
I mean, you can if you like, but I guess I'm sitting here thinking the answer is essentially no, or at least I don't have any formalized conception of memory that I'm working with, but something actually quite different, which might sound a little bit strange. But one of the things I'm interested in is what people call the Anthropocene.
Yes.
So this is this idea that we've entered a new geological epoch as a result of human activity, and the extent of human activity on Earth processes and systems. And it's become a bit of a kind of contested political issue. But at root, geologically, in order to define a new epoch, what you have to be able to say is that you can see globally some evidence in the rock record. And what I'm interested in, therefore, is the idea that the rock record itself functions as a kind of memory for planetary processes. So I'm not necessarily sure which of your possible models of memory that would fit into, but some of the people I read talk about the way in which the Earth itself could be said to, I quote, kind of remember and forget things that human beings have done to it. So I guess it's a kind of metaphorical or even analogical use of memory. But the idea, potentially kind of worryingly, is that things that we arguably are getting wrong now will be preserved. They will be remembered by the rocks for millennia to come. So yeah, I don't know if that fits with the sort of theories of memory that you...
It does. Well, one that was a traditional view of memory that lasted a long time, but is now being challenged is, of course, Aristotle's versus and Plato's wax tablet model of memory, which sounds like rock memory, and it's the idea that memory is acquired when experiences imprint themselves on us, and then we reproduce memory as if it's on a wax tablet when we remember. What the I wouldn't say is leading, but an emerging view of memory, for which I advocate, is the idea that memories and static impressions like that, it's something we actively construct in the moment. But I think there's room for both in what you're describing, because the rock memory has to be perceived and interpreted and understood by scientists like yourself. And so they could be using a constructivist, which is that latter form of actively constructing memory in the now. They could be using a constructivist model of memory to interpret something that looks like a wax tablet model of memory.
I think that works very neatly, and that was what was occurring to me as you were speaking, that initially it looks very much like kind of material inscription, and that's that, but it's not entirely kind of uncontestable, because it relies on interpretation in order to work out what that rock record, what that memory is saying. I mean, the sorts of things that one might find in the rock record in millions of years' time will be bits of concrete, and particularly bones from domesticated animals. You know, the number of animals that we have bred largely to eat, their bones are the sorts of things that will survive in the rock record. So someone coming in a few million years' time and looking at it will be like, why are there all these chicken bones at this particular geological horizon?
Or mice.
Right, and in one sense it's inscribed, in another sense an act of interpretation will be needed.
It will required,
to understand what
especially
that memory
if other records are lost.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Thank you. I was really absorbed in that. I wasn't ready for the second question, which is, I've heard the claim that the discovery of deep time has rewritten the biblical account of time. So I'm quoting here, the discovery of deep time has rewritten the biblical account of time. Do you agree with this?
I think a lot depends on what is meant by a biblical account of time. So, as I was alluding to earlier on, yes, the discovery of deep time led to some debates about the age of the Earth. So if one reads the opening sections of Genesis in a literal sense and attaches that to a view of the Earth as being, say, 7,000 years old, then yes, the discovery of deep time requires a rewrite or a rethink of that particular view. The Earth is not 6,000 years old. The Earth is not even 20 million years old, which is one of the calculations that Lord Kelvin had done to try and work out scientifically the age of the Earth based on its rate of cooling. And the geological discovery of people like Hutton was to extend that way, way further. So that does require rethinking biblical accounts of time. But I'm no biblical scholar, but I wonder if there are also some other biblical accounts of time that are quite different to that. I guess I particularly think of those passages in Ecclesiastes that talk about, a time for X, a time for Y.
Yes.
That's, to me, I know very little about it, but that to me suggests quite a different understanding or conception of time, which is potentially much more interesting to dialogue with when you're talking about this geologists and their millions and billions of years.
Yes. And I suppose if you step outside of human time and think about biblical account of eternity, then it doesn't really challenge that, does it? The idea of deep time, because eternity, in a sense, extends even beyond deep time on either end.
Yeah, interesting question. So, one of the things that I've been trying to think through with the work I'm doing on deep time is quite what the relationship is between those two things.
Okay.
So, I think the way that I'm increasingly thinking about it is to see deep time as an extension of the horizontal dimension, whereas eternity is something in the vertical dimension.
Okay.
Potentially.
Yes.
So yeah, you could take sort of human history and say you need to set that in within geological history, and you're expanding the horizontal timeline. And you could say that eternity is just to expand horizontally again.
Yes.
But I wonder if eternity is perhaps a different dimension, if you like, or needs to be drawn in vertically there.
Yes.
So I guess I'm not, to talk about deep time, to talk about what happens in the deep future is not, I don't think, necessarily the same as talking about what happens in eternity.
Yes.
It's talking about the deep planetary future. The fate of this particular planet is what I'm very interested in. And often our visions, our eschatologies, our utopias, our dystopias, religious and non-religious, are thinking about that deep future in a horizontal sense.
Yes.
But sometimes also in that vertical sense.
Yes.
And I sometimes worry that we confuse the two, actually.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
Gosh. It raises for me a question that I'll try and formulate it in articulate terms, but it's just beginning to form itself in my mind. Do you, as an earth scientist, do you work with a particular model of time theory? And I'm thinking of the leading theories of presentist versus eternalist. So presentist being the idea that only present objects exist, versus eternalist, which is the idea of the present, the future and the past coexist in the present. So there's some when exist in the now. Do you work with one of these models, and how do they impact your understanding of deep time?
I think that's a really good question. When I was a scientist, I wouldn't have been able to say anything about any of that. And I don't want to do down any colleagues, but my sense is that a lot of practicing scientists have not considered this. They don't have an underlying philosophy that is in any way influencing what they do day to day in the laboratory.
Theoretical physicists tend to have
I guess I'm talking about geologists.
Yes.
And one of the things that's slightly weird even, or slightly interesting, is that geologists get very used to throwing around long time scales. And they'll say, 300 million years ago, this, as if it was yesterday. And it's just because they're very used to working with those sorts of timescales. And that in itself, I think, is kind of anthropologically interesting, how we become sort of slightly normalized as a set of scientific practitioners into thinking it's just 300 million years ago, that's normal. But it's actually an unimaginably long period of time for one individual human being to contemplate. But I don't think most geologists are talking about whether or not they have a presentist or eternalist philosophy of time. In hearing you describe those positions, I don't think many would be presentists if you kind of explained it to them and kind of pushed it. I don't think many would say only the present moment is what really exists, precisely because they look at the rock record and they think it's this thing from the past, and they would probably be quite resistant to a kind of constructivist view of the past or of memory. But I might be doing geologists a disservice here, but I certainly know for myself that I wasn't really thinking in those terms when I was doing science, and it's only now that I'm beginning to think about, if you like, the kind of philosophy of geology,
Yes.
and what that is, and how that then compares to theological understandings of time. Yeah.
But how does it impact how you consider deep time, do you think? Which model of memory you hold, if it has any kind of impact in your, not just geologists now, in your understanding of deep time?
Yeah, I mean, I would similarly be a little bit nervous about a purely presentist understanding, I think. In a sense, actually, what quite a lot of people are doing, I mentioned the sort of popular literature that's invoking this concept of deep time. And a lot of what people in that sphere are doing are critiquing a certain form of presentism.
Yes.
And I'm not necessarily saying that these things always have to be or necessarily linked. But if you are of the opinion that it's only really the present that exists and the past and the future are constructed, it's not too far to go from that to a moral position where only the present matters.
Yes.
Right? And that's what people writing about deep time are actually wanting to push back against. So a lot of people who are thinking about deep time as it extends into the future are talking about the moral importance of what comes in the future, and the lives of our descendants, the lives of future generations, the importance of intergenerational thinking, intergenerational justice. A lot of those ways of thinking are saying that an awful lot more than the present matters. And similarly, one of the interesting things is the way in which we use, and I don't really like this phrase, but the Earth's resources, or for example, the fossil fuels that exist, are used in an incredibly presentist way, as in, once you've dug up coal and burnt it, it's going to take a geological length of time to create more coal, and we can only afford to do that once. You know, it's effectively a finite resource. So an awful lot of the problems, I think, can be attributed to a certain kind of presentism, at least for people thinking in this kind of environmental and ecological sphere. Yeah,
that is a good point, that there is a way of approaching presentism that limits how you view the impact of your actions. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't think it's the only way, right?
Yeah,
but it's one way.
No, I know. Yeah, and also, I think that's fascinating. I hadn't really connected seeing moral results as a result of your theory of time. It's fascinating. The idea of deep time implies that humanity's existence is infinitesimal. Does this force a rethink of Christian meta-narrative, wherein humanity is at the centre of creation?
Yeah, so I think this is the sort of thing that Stephen Jay Gould was getting at when I mentioned earlier, and is actually brought home really nicely by, I also mentioned John McPhee, who coined this phrase deep time. He has an analogy which is frankly kind of scary, but if you were to plot the entirety of Earth history as extending along a line from your nose to the end of your fingertips, that's the whole of Earth history. A single stroke of a nail file on your fingertips would erase all of human history. That's how little of geological time humans have been around for, and that has almost a kind of existential impact on us, and could potentially massively reinforce a sense of insignificance. And I think this kind of goes two different ways. So on the one hand, yes, Christian theology has often been accused of being very human-centered, very anthropocentric, and this does quite a lot to undercut that. If we've inhabited such a small slice of time, we're perhaps not nearly as important as we like to think we are. And by and large, I find that a helpful or useful challenge to Christian theology. I think an awful lot of theology that I read and come across is still quite anthropocentric, and by and large, for people operating in this kind of ecological space, that's a problem to some degree. It's not necessarily completely escapable. We are human beings. We are going to be a little bit human-centered. So broadly, I welcome that challenge. There is, however, the flip side, an extreme one can go to, which would be misanthropic, as in if you keep going along this road and keep saying humans are just totally insignificant on geological timescales. Effectively, human beings don't really even matter.
Yes.
That, I think, is a worrying and damaging line of thinking too. And some of the things that some more extreme environmentalists say are along those lines. And I mean, one of the things I remember seeing during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, is the phrase "humans are the virus," which leads to some pretty dark conclusions, right? Or some pretty horrifying conclusions as to, well, if we just got rid of humanity, that would be the answer. So I think it needs to be treated slightly carefully. It's an important wake-up call for theologians, but you don't want to go too far down that line of thinking.
So the challenge to theologians and, I guess, philosophers is to try and give an anthropological account of humanity that argues for our profound significance, even though we're just a blink in the whole scheme of things. And how do you do that, I guess, is the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not 100% sure if we want to have a profound significance. You know, I do think what's helpful about this is that it encourages us theologians to think about the rest of creation. So I don't think humans are uniquely significant necessarily.
Oh, I don't use profound significance in the term, in the sense that we're supremely or uniquely significant. I meant it in a psychological way of thinking my existence is profound,
right?
But not but that doesn't place me above or even in relation to anything else. It's just, how do I make meaning of my life, even though really I and the rest of humanity are a flash in the pan.
Right, yeah, no, I see what you mean. That existential dimension, I agree, is important. I guess I'm thinking of some of what people say in eco-theology, where an awful lot of ink has been spilled on those lines in Genesis about, it's Genesis 1, 27, 28, about human beings having dominion over the rest of creation, being invited to subdue the rest of creation, and the worrying sort of dominating anthropocentrism that might encourage. And then the rereading of that has been done, which is to say, oh, it's not a dominating form of dominion, it's a kind of caretaking form of dominion, and dominion has been replaced by this non-biblical concept of stewardship. So humans still have this sort of separate managerial role. And again, I must admit, I find that not entirely convincing, because it still separates out human beings as having this kind of completely unique function. And if we're such a small slice of geological time, who was stewarding or caretaking creation before our arrival? Well, I don't think it was us. And perhaps, again, it's not a terribly pleasant vision, but who will be stewarding or caretaking creation after human extinction? It won't be us. So I'm a little bit sceptical about that, but that's not to say that human individuals, and indeed the humanity as some sort of collective or species, thinks about itself as profound or significant in some way. Yeah, exactly.
If you allow me to take us off tangent a little bit, but in relation to what we're discussing. In a previous conversation with Professor Ben Quash on Christian art, we talked a lot about image, and it's related to what we're talking about now, because I guess theologians would argue that what makes humanity unique, even though I don't agree, I have to stress this, what makes humanity unique is that we are made in the image of God. So how might one respond to that pushback if you within deep time? So they could say, yes, stewardship began when humanity began, because only humanity is made in the image of God. How might you respond to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have read eco-theologians who would, and they're on slightly sketchy ground here, but I think it's interesting, who would say, actually, when you go to the biblical account, it doesn't say that other species aren't in the image of God.
Yes.
It just says human species are. And I think this is perhaps playing with the text a little bit, but there are people who would want to say we're not the only things in the image of God.
Yes.
There are other things potentially in the image of God. So radically expanding that conception of the Imago Dei, that would be one route you could go down. I guess another route would be to actually ask, what does it mean to be in the image of God?
Yes.
Does being in the image of God mean anything about control or caretaking or stewardship? Is that the godlike quality that humans are said to reflect? Or is it something else? And if it's something else, it might be something potentially more palatable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Does thinking about deep time necessarily entail long-termism? That is the moral worldview that our actions in the present have very long-term, up to trillions of years, consequences for the future of the universe. So does deep time entail long-termism?
So I think the short answer is no. So I think long-termism is a quite specific brand of philosophical thinking that has developed recently, that's associated with a few other movements in philosophy, so particularly the effective altruism movement, and it tends to be pretty utilitarian in its thinking. So it adds up the number of potential future human beings, which is potentially very large, and it compares them with the number of human beings that exist in the present and indeed have existed in the past. So, I mean, one of the books that's in this area is William McCaskill's What We Owe the Future. I think it's a very clear articulation of this way of thinking. It's quite a persuasive argument as to why we need to give a lot more consideration than we do to those many, many human beings that come in the future. But it also leads to some conclusions that I think not everybody is completely comfortable with, because of its very utilitarian way of thinking, because there's the number of people in the future is so much bigger than the number of people in the present. It can lead one potentially to slightly neglect the inequalities and oppressions that already exist in the present amongst people alive today. So if you kind of take it very logically to its extreme, it might be excusing you from worrying about some things that we need to worry about today. And I know, at least for myself, that I'm just slightly uncomfortable with that. So there's an overlap, obviously, between that particular philosophy and what people are doing with deep time and deep time thinking. But I don't think they're exactly the same. And the people who are talking about long-termist philosophy are often worried about a whole series of what they call existential risks, of which climate change is only one. So nuclear war would be another. The rise of AI would be another. All sorts of things to do with the nature of human conflict. There are all sorts of potentially existential risks for humanity as a species. And I guess in my work, I'm primarily only really interested in the ecological and climatic concerns there. So again, I would differentiate the sort of thing I'm trying to think about a little bit from that long-termist philosophy, whilst recognising there's a bit of overlap.
I wonder if that brings us back to that idea of theologians and philosophers arguing for the significance of people as persons. Because if you think of people in terms of utility, basic unit of happiness, or in quantitative terms, and you count humans and their capacity for happiness, and you reduce it to that, then maybe you fall into there are some pitfalls with that kind of thinking. But when you think that human experience on a day-to-day basis, as mundane as it is, really deeply matters in some way, then maybe it changes how long-termist, it could challenge how long-termist some of their conclusions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, human beings aren't just measurable entities. I think we're more than that.
So how can we avoid, I guess I've anticipated my own question, how can we avoid the pitfalls of long-termism in using the notion of deep time in relation to moral action? So one pitfall is ignoring the needs of those alive today or in the near future in favor of preserving humanity's potential in the long-term future.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's quite a tricky question, and I think there's actually quite a number of concerns one might have at this intersection of long-termist thinking and deep time. So one of the ones which I think is particularly interesting, someone called Michelle Bastian has written interestingly on this. She writes about what she calls chrono-washing.
Okay.
Which is by parallel with greenwashing. So
Yes.
for companies come along, tell you they're going to be environmentally friendly, but what they do is different from what they're saying. And she's worried that this happens in relation to the way in which people are talking about time. So her specific, or one of her specific examples of this is a project called The Clock of the Long Now, which is funded by Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame.
Yes.
And the idea with the Clock of the Long Now is that it's an engineering challenge. It's a project to try and design a clock that will keep time for the next 10,000 years.
Okay.
And it's being worked on at the moment. Various prototypes have been built. I think they're currently constructing one in the middle of a mountain in Texas.
Okay.
And it's interesting as an engineering challenge.
Yes.
And what the people working on the Clock of the Long Now say is that it's expanding our temporal horizons.
Yes.
So in general, it's a good thing for deep time thinking. It's getting us to think longer term. It might get us to think longer term about the repercussions of our actions. Yet at the same time, and this is what Bastian points out, something like Amazon is predicated on something which could be described as incredible short-termism.
Yes.
It's about the immediate gratification of desire by being able to click on something and it arrive at your doorstep tomorrow.
Yeah.
And those things are kind of incompatible. So the
Yes.
accusation she makes is that it's a form of chrono-washing. It's pretending to be interested in the long term whilst only being interested in the short term. So that's the first of quite a series of potential traps, I think. Another accusation that is levelled at deep time thinking or at long term thinking is that it's essentially it's an extension of the human desire to control the future.
Yeah.
So one of the common narratives, at least since the Enlightenment, is that we're on some sort of timeline of progression, and that things are improving, humans are making the world a better place. And there is a concern amongst some people that when we invoke deep time, we're just wanting to invoke that timeline of progress and control over the future. And so it's actually just about human beings wanting to retain the dominance they have for very long time periods into the future. And I guess another aspect of this that also slightly concerns me is that when we talk about these things, we tend to universalize. So particularly when people appeal to science, whether it's geological science or cosmological science or anything else, there is if you like, a geological prediction, a cosmological prediction of how things are going to pan out in the future. And that is held to be kind of universally true. And I'm not saying that that the science is wrong here, but I do think a certain way in which the scientific narrative is portrayed and popularized doesn't leave space for other views of the future.
Yes.
And I think actually we'll have a better sense of what the future is about or could be about by drawing on multiple perspectives and kind of trumpeting science as the only discipline that's allowed to speak about the future, the only discipline that's allowed to imagine or conceive of the future, and presenting it as a kind of universal narrative risks kind of running roughshod over different temporal visions. And that's some of what you see in the deep time discourse, is that there's not enough space made for multiple perspectives on deep time. I mean, so this is something. There's a whole kind of school of philosophy called Afrofuturism. This is exactly their criticism of some of what's going on here. Is that there are visions of the future that are being neglected, and unfortunately, you see some of that in deep time thinking. I'm conscious. All I've done is set out more problems rather than offer solutions.
Then you've done good philosophical work.
So I'm not 100% sure how we avoid these problems without, other than just being aware of them and being conscious of them. I mean, another thing that I am fairly acutely aware of is that quite a lot, not all, but quite a lot of the people who express an interest in deep time are men. I think there's potentially even a gendered dimension to this, not exclusively so, but again that worries me slightly and makes me even question my own interests sometimes about why do I find this stuff fascinating, and is there something I need to be questioning about myself before I kind of carry on with this work. So I can only hope that awareness allows you to avoid some of the kind of problems that might be entailed with this way of thinking.
I think so. I have two quick questions on two topics. One is a topic I don't think you work on necessarily, and the other you do is of interest to you. The first is on the idea of awe, because we've been talking about this vast amount of time, and a key emerging topic in science and religion is awe and wonder. And the second is, I would love to hear about how trauma intercepts your work, because I know part of your interest is in trauma, and I'm trying to see how it fits in your work. So first, awe and wonder, and then we end on trauma.
Sure, I'll do my best. So the awe and wonder is an interesting question, and one that I want to pursue because, as you say, I have not I've not done much work, and I know there is some interesting work in science and religion on awe and wonder, and I guess it stems actually from the discovery of deep time that I was talking about with James Hutton. Another geologist, John Playfair, described visiting one of these sites and, as he put it, staring into the abyss of time. And in fact, the final line of Hutton's book, this famous line, he talks about no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. And both of these, I think, reveal something of the kind of existential nature of the encounter that they have with the geological record, and the sense of awe and wonder that it provokes. Both that sort of humbling aspect that I was talking about before, but also a sense of amazement. And I just have a hunch that some of what people are doing when they're talking about awe would be helpful for those geologists who are trying to make sense of their experience of encountering such a depth of time. So that is something that I would like to try and bring into some of my work in the future, because I think that's very interesting. The question of trauma, is an interesting one. So some of my previous work looked at the idea of environmental or ecological trauma. That is to say, using trauma as a lens or a metaphor or a framework for considering environmental damage and environmental and ecological suffering. And in a sense, that is what led me directly to my interest in deep time. So one of the symptoms of trauma, as human beings experience trauma, is a whole set of temporal symptoms. So people who have suffered trauma will experience flashbacks, recurrences, persistences, and in particular, there is often not a terribly linear or neat timeline of healing and salvation after a traumatic incident, or even a persistent and ongoing trauma. There is something lasting about the impact of trauma, and that is that's what I was working on before. But that idea of something persisting for very long periods of time, without kind of restoration or healing, is what got me into thinking about some of the deep time literature. So I mean, so that was the connection there too. I don't know if I can add one final thing.
Yes.
So the place a lot of this all then ends up for a Christian theologian is in discussions of eschatology.
Yes.
And this is an area I've been thinking about a little bit, and I think is actually kind of challenging. Because as I was saying before, if eschatology is dealing with the eschaton, with an eternal state of affairs, that's not necessarily the same as the long-term deep future,
Yes.
because the deep being on the horizontal axis, eschaton being on the vertical axis. But I think it is still interesting to compare and contrast Christian eschatological visions with some of these other visions of how the deep future might pan out. And to see if it is possible to have a conversation between the two. And again, this is something that has cropped up in the kind of science and religion literature previously, in relation to what cosmologists say about the ultimate fate of the universe. So cosmologists will tell you that the most likely thing is ultimately heat death for the whole universe, which is a pretty bleak, even nihilistic vision. So Christian theologians have had quite a lot of work to do reflecting on that and how that squares with a Christian account of hope. And to what extent the Christian account of hope relies on the material creation for that hope. There's a similar set of questions here, but in a sense on a smaller scale. I'm just talking about the Earth, the planet, and the ultimate future, ultimate fate of the planet, and how whatever that is squares with a Christian understanding of hope. And I think it's difficult territory. I'm not sure anyone has terribly good answers, despite valiant efforts, as to how the heat death of the universe is reconcilable with Christian hope. Similarly, how the ultimate deep time future of the planet, potentially in the absence of human beings, is reconcilable with Christian hope. One of the people who I find interesting on some of this is Catherine Tanner, a contemporary theologian. So she has what she calls a detemporalized eschatology, which I think is interesting because what she does is to disconnect the Christian understanding of the eschaton from the temporal future. So it doesn't actually matter how things pan out, because for her that's not what the eschaton is about. The eschaton is something that is possible at any moment in time and can break into any moment in time. And for her, the eschaton is about a new form of relationship with God. And she actually kind of casts this biblically in terms of a contrast between what is life-giving and what is death-giving. And that life-giving relationship with God is possible at any moment in time. And one of the ways she actually understands this that I think is helpful is by comparing it to doctrines of creation that talk about creation as ongoing. So creation is not just about the temporal beginning, it's about a continuing sustaining of all that there is at every moment in time. She says similarly, let's take eschatology out of endings and imagine it as something that's possible at all moments in time. I think it's quite a neat way of dealing with the question. I'm not necessarily sure the extent to which I agree with that. But that's one of the areas that I'm wrestling with at the minute, trying to have this conversation between Christian theology and the deep time literature.
That's a brilliant place to end, on hope and eschaton and the heat death of the universe, the eternal cold. Thank you so much, Dr. Middleton, for joining us. And it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.